Use some pictures that the medical examiner may be.
We are not going to be making any specific objections. We're not making any objections to this.
All right, very well. Let's bring jurors then. For the state, is there further evidence?
Yes, Your Honor. State will call Michelle Hannon, State Crime Lab.
Ma'am, if you would, please place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you give to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Mr. Lively?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
If you would, please just introduce yourself to the jury and tell them how you're employed.
My name is Michelle Hannon, and I'm a forensic scientist at the North Carolina State Crime Laboratory. I am assigned to the forensic DNA biology section, and I perform DNA analysis.
Okay. And how long have you been working at the State Crime Lab in that capacity?
Since August of 2004.
Can you tell us the duties of your position as a forensic biologist at the crime lab?
I receive evidence that may have been screened through body fluid. I attempt to develop DNA profiles. I then do comparisons to any known standards to the items that of question. And then I will write a report and testify to my findings.
Yes, ma'am. Tell me a little bit about your education, training, and experience in this field.
I received my bachelor's in science from Campbell University with a concentration in biology. When I became employed at the State Crime Laboratory, I tested known samples, unknown samples, and mixed samples. I also entered a supervised casework position where I worked approximately 100 cases under 2 trained analysts. I'm also required to complete proficiency tests twice a year, which I've done.
And have you been doing that since 2004 or?
Since I've been released for casework in 2006.
Yes, ma'am. And do you continue with your education and training as necessary to stay updated in the field and on the job?
Yes, for DNA, the federal government mandates that we have continuing education as well as continue with proficiency tests. I'm also will train new analysts coming in for DNA.
And are you able to give a general figure as to the number of times you've tested items at the State Crime Lab for DNA or a DNA comparison?
When I first started working, I think I was around 100 cases a year. Since we've put up robotics online, I can usually work about 200 cases a year.
Okay. And so that would be consistently since 2006?
Yes.
So it's over 1,000 cases that you've had the opportunity to do in your time?
Yes.
And have you been tendered as an expert before and testified in courts in this state?
I have approximately 90 times in both Superior and Federal Court.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time, I would tender this witness as an expert in forensic DNA analysis or forensic biology.
No objection.
Her testimony will be received as proffered.
Now, Ms. Hannon, it may sound elementary, but can you just explain to the jury a little bit about what DNA is and how we analyze it?
DNA is a chemical found in all living things. You receive half your DNA from your mother and half your DNA from your father, and it's responsible for your physical makeup, such as your eye color, your hair color, how tall you're going to be. When we develop a DNA profile, it's a series of numbers that we look at. It doesn't tell us who put it there, how it got there, how long it's been there. We just have a numerical readout of areas that we look at that are unique. DNA is constant and consistent, meaning like the DNA in your blood is the same as your skin cells or in a pulled hair root, and it's going to be constant throughout your life.
And can you tell us about sort of the procedures or how you analyze blood or swabbings for the presence of DNA?
We will first identify, or I'll first identify what may come from a scene and what may be from a known individual. It'll go through an extraction process. This is where we remove the DNA from the item of evidence. Then we will figure out how much DNA we have. That's followed by an amplification step where we make copies of that DNA. And then we'll separate that DNA by size and fluorescence, and we'll look at the readout and do comparisons.
Okay. Now, I'd like to get right to this case and approach you with several items that have already been submitted into evidence. Your Honor, I have what's marked as Statement Exhibit 225, 239, 240, 242, and 249.
Yes, sir.
Ms. Hannon, do you recognize the items that I've placed in front of you? Starting with States 249, do you recognize that?
I do. It has my initials and the date in which I received the item.
All right, and so you actually recognize your markings on these and a CCBI, I guess, or I'm sorry, an SBI or State Crime Lab number associated with this case, correct?
Correct. And this envelope had multiple items that were generated by, or that was transferred by the body fluid analyst.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to enter States 249 into evidence. I believe 249A through I have already been entered.
Any objection?
No objection.
It's allowed.
Ma'am, if you would just open that envelope and see if you recognize what's in there.
I do.
All right. Well, let's just let's walk through these items one by one. I believe 249A is your item 9-1. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And what is contained in that envelope?
It's a swabbing from the trigger, grip, slide, magazine release, and safety of the pistol.
Were you able to perform a DNA extraction from the contents of that envelope?
Yes, I was.
And how do you actually perform the extraction?
What we will do is we will label a tube with the item number that's in it, and we will add some chemicals as well as, in this case it was a swabbing, so it looks like a regular Q-tip swab. On one side you'll have the cotton, so I'll cut that cotton off of the stick and I'll place it into the tube with the reagents in there.
Okay. What are the reagents?
One is it's mainly like a detergent-based reagent, And then we also add another chemical that will break the cells open that will release your DNA.
All right. And were you able to successfully extract some amount of DNA from that swabbing from item 9.1, which would have been from the trigger, grip, slide, magazine release, and safety of pistol?
Yes, I was.
And then 9.2, can you take a look at that? I think it states 249B.
Correct.
And can you tell me about the extraction you were able to perform on that swabbing?
That would go through the same process.
And that was the swabbing from the muzzle area of the pistol?
That's correct.
Moving on to 16.1 and 16.2, I believe those are both swabbings from boots. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then 17.1 and 17.2, 17.1 is cutting from a sleeve of a hoodie, and 17.2 is the cutting from the front of the hoodie. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you were able to get DNA extractions from both of those as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then your item 20-1 is cutting from jeans. 20-2, the cutting from the back of jeans, and 20-3, the cutting from the front of jeans. Were you able to extract DNA from each of those cuttings?
Yes, I was.
Okay. Now, may I approach again, Your Honor?
Yes.
Also in front of you, so these are the items for review, and then you have some known standards. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and I've got states 225, 239, 240, and 242 in front of you. Starting with 225, can you tell me what's contained in that package?
It is a blood card from Angela Taylor.
What's a blood card?
It's used as a reference sample, so it's a piece of paper with either one big blood stain or multiple stains on it.
And does that allow you, are you able to extract DNA from a blood card?
Yes. And those are used for comparisons.
Sure, okay. And then do you also have DNA swabs from LaTanya Holden, Nathan Holden, and then a blood card from Sylvester Taylor?
Yes.
So you have blood cards for Anglia Taylor and Sylvester Taylor, but DNA swabs for the defendant and LaTanya Holden. Why would you have swabs for them and blood cards for the others?
They could have submitted blood cards for Nathan Holden and LaTanya Taylor. However, they just swabbed the cheek instead.
Okay. And is that just as good a way to develop a DNA profile? I mean, is blood or saliva or skin cells, you can develop it from any of those items?
That's correct.
Okay. And so, when you do the extractions for the four subjects who are the known standards, do you then generate a DNA profile for them, or that's displayed, or how does that work?
Yeah, so that we look at 16 areas, and it'll be displayed in a chart, or it'll come off the computer looking similar to an EKG with a series of spikes and numbers, and then we will translate that information into a chart.
Okay, and why these particular areas? I mean, how do you determine what to do for terms of comparison?
They are established through our guidelines through the federal government, but they are very unique and show variability from person to person.
All right. And so these have been identified as segments or portions within someone's DNA that assist you in determining their individuality, or I mean... It'll
just assist us not necessarily individuality, but there's variations within your chromosomes from person to person. So what we do is we look at repeat regions. So say the first area that we want is a repeat of CAT. Well, your mom may have 12 CATs, your dad could have 20 CATs, but anywhere in the population, they can range from 8 to 45. So there's so much variability in some of these areas that we look at, that the more areas we look at, the more unique your profile is to you.
I see. And so that's sort of how it's these variable areas that you're able to look at, and it then assists you in kind of making a match between a standard and something you're reviewing.
Yes.
All right. Great. Well, after, I guess, extracting from the known standards that you had, let's talk about what you did with each of the items. First of all, item 9-1. Were you able to obtain a DNA profile from item 9-1, which again is the swabbing from the trigger, grip, slide, magazine release, and safety of pistol?
Yes, I was.
And did you what did you find based on that profile?
That profile was consistent with the DNA from the swab taken from the trigger, grip, slide, magazine release, and safety of the pistol is consistent with the DNA profile obtained from LaTanya Holden. The DNA profiles obtained from Angela Taylor, Nathan Holden, and Sylvester Taylor were excluded as contributors to the profile.
Okay. Now, after you make that finding, there's some information here about populations. Can you explain this to me? It says the probability of randomly selecting an unrelated individual with a DNA profile consistent with the DNA profile obtained from the swabbing taken from the trigger, grip, slide, magazine release, and safety of the pistol is approximately, and there's some big numbers here. How do you come to that?
The state of North Carolina has a population database where we asked individuals who have classified themselves as being Caucasian, Lumbee Indian, Hispanic, or Black, and we took those DNA profiles, developed them, and we saw how unique the information was. So whenever we get a match or a consistent with statement in a case, we'll enter the profile that we generated into our database, and it'll formulate the statistic for that.
All right. And so is your opinion that the swabbings taken from item 9-1 were from DNA from LaTanya Taylor, or LaTanya Holden, excuse me?
That it was consistent with LaTanya Taylor's profile, yes.
All right. Let's move to item 9-2. This is the swabbing taken from the muzzle area of the pistol. Were you able to develop a DNA profile there as well?
I developed a DNA profile obtained from the swabbing.
Okay. Now, was it a full profile or a partial profile?
It's a partial profile.
What's the difference?
We look at 16 areas, and if we get a result at all 16, or if we don't get a result at all 16 areas, then we'll say it's a partial.
Why wouldn't you get a result at all 16 areas?
You may just not have a lot of DNA.
Okay, so there's a certain threshold of or amount of DNA that needs to be present for you to potentially test all 16 areas?
Yes.
All right. And why would you have an amount that might be below that threshold?
There may not have been a good transfer from the one item to the other. There may not have just been DNA present. It could have been outside, so sometimes weather can break down DNA or remove it from an item.
Okay. So there's a bunch of reasons why it could happen, but do you know what's the threshold for finding a partial profile?
I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, are there a certain number of areas that you found agreement in so that you could, I guess, give the opinion that a partial DNA profile is obtained?
Yes.
Tell me about that.
So there is a minimum that we require for statistics, which is 3 areas. And they have to be heterozygote and above a threshold. So heterozygote means you have one from each, or it shows 2 different pieces of information. And so we wouldn't believe that you could be missing information from what was developed.
In this case, though, it's what was your finding with regards to this partial DNA profile?
The partial DNA profile was consistent with the DNA profile obtained from LaTanya Holden and the DNA profiles obtained from Angela Taylor, Nathan Holden, and Sylvester Taylor are excluded as contributors to the profile.
All right. So when you say it's consistent with the DNA profile obtained with LaTanya, of the available information you had from the profile, the partial profile, that was consistent with the DNA profile of Miss Holden?
The word consistent with just reflects that I couldn't do a statistical interpretation at all 16 areas. So we'll use the word consistent with. However, the pieces of information that were developed were similar to the standard of LaTanya Holden.
Let's move to item 16.1 and 20.1. So that'd be the swabbing from a boot and a cutting from a jeans. Now, again, from 16.1 and 20.1 or -1, were you able to obtain a DNA profile from that swabbing and that cutting?
Yes, it was.
All right. And what profile did you obtain?
That profile matched the DNA profile obtained from LaTanya Holden.
And again, with regards to Mr. and Mrs. Taylor and the defendant, or Nathan Holden, what opinion did you have regarding?
But they were excluded.
And then in items 16.2, 17.1, 17.2, 20.2, and 20.3. This is the swabbing from the other boot, cuttings from the hoodies, or from the hoodie, and cuttings from the front and back of jeans. Were you able to obtain profiles in each of those pieces of evidence?
It was a swabbing from the same boot, but just a different area, and yes, I was able to develop DNA profiles.
All right. And you say you were able to obtain DNA profiles in this case?
Yes,
So more than one?
correct.
Okay. Well, tell me what you found there.
The DNA profiles obtained from the swabbing of the boot, along with the cuttings taken from the sleeve, front of the hoodie, and jeans are consistent with a mixture of 2 contributors. The predominant DNA profile matches the DNA profile obtained from LaTanya Holden. The DNA profiles obtained from Angela Taylor, Nathan Holden, and Sylvester Taylor are excluded as contributors to this predominant DNA profile, and that the minor component of this mixture is inconclusive due to insufficient quality and or quantity.
All right. So you developed 2 profiles, but only one of them can be identified among the standards. Is that correct? Or among the knowns?
Yes.
And so it says the predominant DNA profile matches the DNA profile obtained from LaTanya Holden. But then there's this minor component that's inconclusive due to insufficient quality and or quantity. Can you tell me what you found there and why that's relevant?
When we have samples, we look first to see if we can figure out how many people may have contributed to that sample. So where I spoke earlier that you have 1 piece of information from your mother, 1 piece of information from your father, if we see more than that, we would state that there was a mixture. And then from there, we would try to subtract the information to see if you have 2 people, 5 people, or what the differences are. So the profiles that I developed all had a predominant profile, just means that one was in a higher concentration than the other. So if you're looking at a jar of marbles and you had orange marbles and blue marbles, where you had more orange to blue, you would say orange was predominant to blue. Sometimes in that jar of marbles, you may only have one blue marble. So you have a piece of information, but it's not enough to tell you who could be another contributor for it. And so that's where the minor component is just insufficient of quality and quantity.
But you could tell that there was some other contributor to the, and again, these are items from the hoodie, the jeans, and the boot, is that correct?
Yeah, there's extra information. It just wasn't enough to interpret.
All right. And when you say it wasn't enough to interpret, I mean, so it was even below the threshold of 3?
When you're dealing with a minor component, there's a few extra rules that go along with it. Do you have enough to meet the minor standard for a calculation? But when you're dealing with possible low levels of DNA, you may only have one of the pieces of information when you really need 2 pieces of information. So sometimes you could have an incomplete profile to where you wouldn't be able to interpret either.
Okay. Now, so you obtained a mixture, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there were 2 different people's blood on these items. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. DNA can be transferred in lots of other ways besides blood. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay. So there's nothing in your opinion that is saying that you believe that there was someone else's blood on any of these items of clothing?
I can just say that the DNA profiles were developed, but I don't know how they got there or what they were from.
But right, but if you're taking your if you're developing your extraction from a swabbing or from a piece of clothing that has blood on it, could DNA also that was there before the blood also be extracted?
Yes.
Okay. All right. What did you do with the with all the items of evidence after you conducted your examination and analysis and formed your opinions?
I transferred the evidence back to the section's evidence technician at the time, Sarah Clay.
All right, Sarah Clay, and she's one of your evidence custodians. Is that correct?
Correct.
And when did you do your examination?
In February of 2016.
Okay. And again, you weren't aware of any details of the crime. You're just essentially given a brief synopsis and asked to do a particular analysis based on the swabbings and cuttings that are presented to you. Is that right?
Yes.
And you don't receive the entire article of clothing. You just received those small envelopes that had either the swabbings or cuttings in them. Is that right?
In this case, I didn't receive the whole item of clothing, but there are times that we could receive it in a case.
All right. And why might you do that in the case?
You're looking for wearer of an item, and it didn't need a body fluid screening. So we may just get a hat or a whole sweatshirt that could be left at a scene that doesn't have any visible staining on it.
Yeah. Your Honor, I'd ask for permission to approach.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'd like for you to hand me those scissors right there. I'm going to open for you State's Exhibit 249A. This is the swabbing from the trigger and the grip, the muzzle area of the gun. Your 9.1 or 9-1. Can you take a look at that and maybe just if you could show the jurors what a swabbing in this case looks like, and kind of describe how it's used to extract the DNA.
So when it's collected from body fluid, if it's wet, they'll slide a little holder over a stick, so the moisture won't transfer to the outside of the envelope. And they'll usually cap where the swab was. And at this end, it had the swab or the cotton portion, and I just went in and removed as much of the swab as I could with a scalpel.
Okay, so with a scalpel, you removed the top of the swab, maybe not cutting the stick, but just getting the cotton off the top?
Yes.
All right, great. Thank you. Next, I'm going to show you 249B, which is the swabbing from the muzzle area of the pistol. If you could just show that to the jury.
Again, it has the same.
Okay, thank you. And again, from both of these swabbings, from these different areas of the pistol, you obtained the DNA profile of LaTanya Holden, is that correct?
Yes, it was consistent with the DNA profile obtained from LaTanya Holden.
All right, and this is 249C, which I believe is a swabbing from a boot,
Yes,
is that correct?
that is.
Okay, could you show that to the jury? And that's also your item 16-1, is that correct?
Yes,
Okay, and again, you found the DNA profile of LaTanya Holden on that.
that it matched the DNA profile obtained from LaTanya Holden, yes.
249D is another swabbing from a boot. Would you take a look at that? You can show it to the jury. And again, this is 16-2. This is the one where you found a mixture of two contributors. Is that correct?
Yes,
The prominent DNA profile matching LaTanya Holden.
it matched her DNA profile, yes.
Now, this is states 249E, and this appears to be a cutting taken from the sleeve of a hoodie. Would you examine that item and tell us if you recognize it?
I do.
Okay. And again, the DNA profile obtained from that swabbing was again consistent with the mixture both of LaTanya Holden and an unknown contributor.
Uninterpretable.
Uninterpretable.
Yes.
Okay. Now, if you can pull that back out, I don't see any blood on there visibly. Is that because of the extraction, or can you show the jurors of where you might have extracted it from?
So when we get a cutting, the body fluid analyst will cut a big circle and draw around it, and I cut half of the sample. There is some light staining on this item, but I would have consumed another portion of this that also had light staining.
I see. Okay. Next is states 249F. This appears to be another cutting. No, I don't see anything in there. Why is there nothing in there?
I consumed it during analysis.
Okay, but that was a cutting from the front of the hoodie. How do you consume it?
It'll be a small cutting, generally speaking, and it'll be placed in the tube. Sometimes it's based on how visible the stain is for us to to use or how big it is for us to use. Same with a swab, that cotton portion goes into a tube. You can do that with cuttings as well.
Okay, so sometimes the process of extraction actually consumes or uses up the fabric?
Because we don't know how much DNA is on the item, we can consume that whole item to try to extract to develop our DNA profiles.
All right, looks like none of this got consumed. Will you take a look at states 249, I think G, H, and I, and tell us what they are and you took a show to the jury?
This is another cutting where I took a cutting from, there was a bigger cutting and I took part of the sample. I do recognize them because they're in the same conditions as when I mailed them back or transferred them back to the evidence technician. So this was 249G. (249H) will look very similar. I took a portion of the cutting from the body fluid analyst. And 249I. Again, I took a portion of this to perform my analysis.
Okay. And again, in each of those, your extractions revealed the profile of LaTanya Holden. Is that correct?
Yes, it was her profile, DNA profile.
And in each extraction, you essentially were extracting from areas that the previous blood analyst had found the presence, at least presumptively, of blood on these clothings.
That they identified, yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you, ma'am. I don't have anything further.
Cross-examination.
No question.
All right, thank you, ma'am. You may step down. Further evidence?
Yes, Your Honor. The state will call. Dr. Craig Nelson with the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner.
Place your blood, place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you give to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Mr. Lively?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, sir. Would you please introduce yourself to the jury and tell us how you're employed?
Dr. Craig, C-R-A-I-G, Nelson, N-E-L-S-O-N. I am an Associate Chief Medical Examiner at the North Carolina Office of the Chief Medical Examiner.
Yes, sir. And how long have you been in that position with the Chief Medical Examiner?
Since January of 2014.
Right. And can you tell us a little bit about your role and responsibilities at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner?
As an Associate Chief Medical Examiner, I am a forensic pathologist. We are charged with examination of sudden unexpected deaths. Those may be homicides, suicides, accidents, or sudden natural deaths. We investigate those deaths by performance of autopsy or external examination, and then generation of a report from those examinations.
Yes, sir. And so you're licensed to practice medicine in the state of North Carolina?
In North Carolina and California, yes.
Sir, would you tell us a little bit about your education, your medical training, and your experience?
I have a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Wake Forest University and a medical degree from Wake Forest University School of Medicine, which used to be known as Bowman Gray. I completed a 4-year anatomic and clinical pathology residency at the University of Arizona in Tucson and a 1-year forensic pathology fellowship at the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office, finishing that in 2008. From mid-2008 until the beginning of 2014, I was employed as a deputy medical examiner for the County of San Diego, essentially performing the same role in San Diego that I do now for the state of North Carolina. At the beginning of 2014, I transferred to my current position. As mentioned, I'm licensed to practice medicine in North Carolina and in California. I am board certified in anatomic and clinical pathology and board certified in forensic pathology.
Yes, sir. And can you tell the jurors a little bit about what's involved in the process of becoming board certified?
The process of becoming board certified involves first completing the required rotations for residency, in my case, anatomic and clinical pathology, which involves 2 branches of pathology. Following the end of residency or towards the end of residency, we take a rigorous 2-day examination. And then I'm also board certified in forensic pathology, so at the end of my 1-year fellowship, I took a 1-day examination covering all of the various areas of forensic pathology as well.
Yes, sir. And I imagine that in your position as associate head medical examiner that you've had cause to testify in trials and courts in the state as an expert.
Previously, one time in Guilford County so far, as I've only been in this office for 3 years, I've previously testified in court around 50 times before, mostly in California.
Yes, sir. And again, how many years were you with the medical examiner's office in, I believe it was San Diego?
Yes, for my 1-year fellowship and then another 5.5 years afterward.
All right. And you've been here for essentially 3 years, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Your Honor, this time I'd tender Dr. Nelson as an expert in the field of forensic pathology, Your Honor.
No objection.
His testimony will be received as proffered.
Can you sort of explain forensic pathology to the jurors as a field?
Pathology in general is the study of injury and disease in the human body. In forensic pathology, we specifically look at injury and disease as they bring about death. As part of our training, we learn to examine gunshot wounds, stab wounds, burns, blunt force trauma, as well as any extensive natural disease that may bring about a sudden death. Our main tool in doing so is autopsy or external examination. In an autopsy, we begin first by confirming the identification of the person we believe that we are to autopsy. That's usually done by paperwork. We then complete first an external portion of the exam, looking at normal things like hair color, eye color, looking at identifying marks like scars and tattoos, and then moving on to examine for any external evidence of injury. After that point, the body is opened with removal of the organs of the chest and torso, or chest and abdomen and pelvis, as well as removal of the brain and the structures of the neck. The organs are weighed, and each of those structures is examined for evidence of trauma and natural disease. In the course of the autopsy, we may add microscopic study to look for any microscopic evidence of disease or other findings. We will take specimens for toxicology analysis, which is done by the laboratory in our office. And then finally, we will generate a report that summarizes findings.
Yes, sir. And how do you, I guess sort of how do you receive your cases? Who requests autopsies to be done? How do the bodies come to you?
Our office will be notified of a death by a law enforcement agency, by EMS, by hospitals, or if it is, excuse me, from a county outside of Wake County by the county medical examiner. In this case, here in Wake County, we typically receive a call from emergency medical services or law enforcement.
Yes, sir. And I want to move right into this case. There are, I believe on April the 10th of 2014, you may have conducted 2 separate autopsies. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And with regards to the first of the two, well, I don't know which order you did them in. It looks like you actually did Sylvester Taylor's autopsy first at 9:35 in the morning. Is that right?
I'll refer to my report to
Yes, sir.
agree with that time. I believe that's correct.
All right. And then it looks like at about a few minutes after 1 in the afternoon, you may have conducted an autopsy on a Anglia Taylor. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. If you don't mind, I'd like to go out of order and start with the autopsy of Anglia Taylor. Do Sylvester? Yeah. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll go in chronological order if you don't mind. Then we'll actually do the autopsy of Sylvester Taylor first. Again, referring to your report, the date and time of this exam was April 10th, 2014 at 9:35 in the morning.
That's correct.
Okay. And this was done. Where is your facility?
Our facility is located on District Drive, which is in the western part of the Raleigh area.
Yes, sir. It's kind of over near the RBC Center and maybe Lake Boone Trail, that part of town.
That's correct.
Okay. And who else would have been present for the autopsy?
Along with me was my assistant, Ms. Judy Page, and Wake County Sheriff's Detective Bell, who was seated in an observation area.
So is the room, the room where the autopsy is performed, if you can describe it for us?
It's a large room with four separate autopsy tables. Each table has a sink and dissection area nearby. So the body will be examined on the table, the organs removed there, and then completion of the organ examination will take place in the dissection bench.
I see. And you and Miss Page would be the only ones physically in the room with the deceased?
Typically, we have other autopsies going at the other autopsy stations, and I don't record who all is present in the room, just the people who were involved with the case.
Well, is it normal or standard for a law enforcement officer to be present for an autopsy where it's a suspected homicide?
It's standard for them to be in our observation room, which is adjacent to the autopsy room but separated by a glass panel. We typically, if we need to talk to anyone who's in there, have to go through another door and open a small window in order to have any discussion. They may observe the autopsy via a closed-circuit television that's in the room as well as directly through the glass, but it's fairly commonplace for law enforcement to be present during the autopsy.
All right. Well, again, let's go to Sylvester Taylor Sr.'s autopsy. Can you tell the jury what the major findings were of your autopsy or diagnoses?
He had been shot at least 4 times, and I use the word at least because he had first, not in order, I cannot tell you the order in which the shots were struck his body, but the order in which I'll discuss them. First, one that entered in his right hip, one that entered in the left side of his upper back, one that entered in the left side of his chest, and another entering in the left side of the chest. And that bullet also appeared to have gone through the chest and then entered the right arm. So he had 5 separate areas of gunshot wounds on his body, but it appeared to be just from being shot 4 times.
All right. And again, you mentioned the entrance wounds of torso to perforating gunshot wounds of the torso. So what's a perforating gunshot wound as opposed to a penetrating?
In my autopsy report, I'll use the terms penetrating and perforating sometimes to describe gunshot wounds. In a penetrating gunshot wound, a bullet enters the body and does not exit. In a perforating gunshot wound, the bullet enters the body and exits the body. So you may hear that referred to as a through and through gunshot wound also.
All right. And so there's one penetrating gunshot wound to the torso, two perforating gunshot wounds to the torso, and a perforating gunshot wound to the torso with a bullet re-entry to the penetrating gunshot wound to the right arm. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's the one that I mentioned that went through the chest and then apparently into the right arm.
Yes, sir. And we're going to talk about each of these wounds individually, but just as we're getting started, I want to go over your diagnosis. You also note one entrance wound with stippling and soot deposition. Can you explain to the jury what stippling and soot deposition means?
When a firearm discharges, more comes out of the end of the gun than just the bullet. There's soot, there's smoke, there may be flame, and there's burning and unburned gunpowder particles. If a person is close enough to the end of the gun when it fires, some of that material may end up being deposited on the skin, and that can give us some indication about how close the gun was to the skin. The term stippling refers to very small or punctate or dot-like abrasions on the skin around an entrance wound, and those come from burning and unburned gunpowder particles striking the skin and causing little abrasions. When we see that in forensic pathology, we can say that the range of fire was within a few inches to a few feet. We can't, though, be more specific than that without test firing or having someone test fire the same weapon with the same type of ammunition. But we can at least say it was within a few inches to a few feet.
All right, and then conversely, the absence of soot or stippling would indicate to you that the shot was fired from more than a few feet.
That is one possibility, but an absence of soot or stippling doesn't guarantee that, because if someone is wearing clothing that the soot or the gunpowder particles couldn't penetrate, it may have still been close, but we wouldn't see anything on the skin. Or perhaps if there was a car window between the victim and the firearm, the barrel of the firearm may have been very close, but that glass would initially absorb the soot and the gunpowder from the discharge of the firearm.
I see. So while the presence of it would allow you to say something about the distance, the absence of it wouldn't necessarily allow you to say the opposite, that there are other factors that could be at play.
That's correct.
Okay. And again, as I mentioned, we're going to go through everything you did, but could you just sort of detail to the jury what internal injuries you observed during your autopsy of Mr. Taylor?
The totality of his gunshots resulted in injuries of his lungs, his spleen, his stomach, his liver, and his intestines.
And did you also note, I guess, multiple directions of or paths of these multiple gunshot wounds?
Yes. In my report, I mentioned that bullets were traveling through the body both frontward and backward. And I'll note that that's in reference to what we describe as standard anatomic position, which is a person standing up, arms at their sides, palms facing forwards. And I mention that because I can't tell you what position Mr. Taylor was in at the time he received these gunshots. I can only say what direction they passed through the body in reference to that standard position.
Yes, sir. And did you make note of foreign objects you may have recovered from Mr. Taylor's body?
Specifically, I recovered 2 bullets from Mr. Taylor's body.
Yes, sir. And from where were those bullets recovered?
1 bullet was recovered from his chest, and 1 was recovered from his right arm.
All right. Now, it looks like you have another finding or diagnosis there. I think you said when you were explaining forensic pathology and the autopsies that you would look both for signs of trauma and also naturally occurring disease in the body.
That's correct.
All right. And so did you make some finding about something that may have been naturally occurring in his body?
I did. I found that he had some degree, a moderate degree of narrowing of the coronary arteries. Those are the small arteries that supply blood to the heart muscle itself.
And you noted, and this is based on information given to you, that he was a 66-year-old man.
That's correct.
Would this be particularly unusual to find? And it looks like you characterize it as moderate.
This is not an unusual finding for someone his age.
Yes, sir. Well, let's go next into the identification of Mr. Taylor, the subject of your autopsy. And I've got what the mark states 250 through 257. Nelson, I'm handing you states 250 through 257. Would you just take a look at those photographs and tell us if you recognize what they are?
Yes, these are photographs of Mr. Taylor and his injuries as taken at autopsy.
And they fairly accurately depict him at the time of your autopsy?
They do.
Okay. Your Honor, I'd move states 250 to 257 into evidence.
Any objection? They're admitted for illustrative purposes.
And would they assist you in illustrating your testimony, sir?
Yes.
Well, you first have to identify your subject, is that correct?
Yes.
All right, and looking at states 250, that'd be the face. Is this how Mr. Taylor was when you did your autopsy or examination?
Yes, and I'll mention that Mr. Taylor was not previously known to me. I received his body as labeled with his name, having previously been identified.
Yes, sir, and so it was previously identified for you, and then you, it looks like some sort of tag or marking down on the neck. Can you tell us who placed that there and what it indicates?
The tag seen there is a unique number generated by our office, given to each body that comes to our office.
All right. And does that correspond with the report for the autopsy of Mr. Taylor?
Yes, this is the number pictured there that corresponds to his autopsy report.
All right. Well, if you would, just take us through your initial external examination of the body.
As follows the standard procedure that I mentioned earlier. First, make sure that my paperwork matches the identification that is received with the body. Then beginning with examination of clothes, any medical items that may be there. In his case, he was wearing some clothes that included pajama bottoms, boxer shorts, a t-shirt, and a pair of eyeglasses. And then proceeding through with documenting normal things, hair color, eye color, identifying markings, and then the external evidence of injury.
Yes, sir. And you know, aside from the external evidence of the injuries, was there anything particularly noteworthy about his physical appearance?
His physical appearance was what I would expect for a man of his age.
Yes, sir. Okay. And it looks like you noted that there was no suit seen on the clothing, though it may have been obscured by soaked blood. Is that correct?
No soot.
Yes, sir.
That's correct. I did not see any soot on the clothes, so I didn't see any evidence on the clothing that a firearm was discharged right next to them. But as mentioned, there was blood on the clothes, so that may have wiped out any soot.
I see. And so when he arrives to you, he's not stripped. You actually remove the clothes from him?
In his case, yes.
Okay. All right. And in other cases, people might have received some medical treatment and you know, then been brought to you after being at a hospital, and maybe they may not be clothed. Is that correct?
That's correct. Sometimes medics trying to render aid will cut clothing from someone, or if someone has been to a hospital, their clothing has been removed. And by the time they pass and come to our office, they have no clothing on.
But in a case where someone is found and are obviously deceased, would it be preferable to you to receive them clothed so that you can kind of see them how they were found without any other intervention?
Yes, I feel it aids in our autopsy examination.
Okay. And you did note that the clothing was blood soaked.
That's correct.
All right. Well, let's talk about the injuries, and there are several here, and you've sort of lettered them. So, if we could, I'd like to begin with the penetrating gunshot wound of the torso, and you've marked that D. Is that correct?
Excuse me, I'm going to refer to my report. Yes. Just for reference for the jury, when I begin an autopsy, I can see that there are entrance and exit wounds, but I don't immediately know which exit wound might be associated with which entrance wound. And so I arbitrarily assigned letters. So you may hear us referring to entrance D or entrance C, and then certain entrance wounds will go with exit wounds. They're not necessarily going to be in alphabetical order, not because I don't understand the alphabet, but because it just makes it easier as I work my way through. I can figure out, aha, C matches with exit E.
Right, and so it's not as if you have an opinion or can say that A happened first, B happened second, C happened third, correct?
That's correct. I have no idea in what order these were actually sustained.
Yes, sir. Okay, well, with that clarification, let's talk about the bullet to the right chest, penetrating gunshot wound of torso D. You have noted here, I believe, something about the entrance. What can you tell us about this gunshot wound?
It's the entrance itself that I labeled D, and that is located on the left hip.
Okay, and this is States 251. Can you kind of, and if he may have permission to stand, Your Honor, point out for the jury where entrance wound D is?
For the record, I'll be pointing roughly to the center of this photograph. You can see there's a white label, and if you get close enough to the screen, you can see that that has our autopsy number B14-947, and it has a little scale there. Just above that white label is a gunshot entrance wound that I labeled as D for the purposes of my report.
And just for reference, it appears Mr. Taylor's hand is sort of down at the bottom left of that photograph. Is that correct?
That's correct. And for further reference, in this photograph, the photograph is turned up. Mr. Taylor is lying face down on a table. So really, we should rotate this photograph 90 degrees like you can see here.
Yes,
and
sir.
That might help a little bit. So that is his left hand, and I'm pointing towards the bottom right corner of the screen as we're facing it.
Yes, sir. And I'll zoom in on that a little bit for the jury so you can testify a little bit further about it. Now, you have identified this as a penetrating gunshot entrance wound, correct?
Yes.
How are you able to tell if something's an entrance wound or an exit wound?
Entrance and exit wounds have certain characteristics based on what the bullet is doing to the body. If you imagine a bullet striking the body in super slow motion, the bullet first touches the skin and begins to push its way down into the skin until finally it's pushing with enough force to punch out a hole. And so usually an entrance wound has a round or oval hole or defect. As the bullet passes through the skin, the sides of the bullet scrape the skin and create what we call an abrasion ring or a margin of abrasion around the wound. Looking at this photograph, you see this pink red part that I'm pointing to with my finger, and that is that round or oval defect. And then you see a little bit of a ragged area of scrape around that. Those are characteristics of an entrance wound.
All right, thank you. And when you're, in addition to this, when, you give some very precise measurements of exactly where this gunshot wound entered. Can you tell us kind of how you orient the body, how it's measured, and kind of how you use it to reference the location of a wound?
I mentioned we refer to the body and directions on the body in reference to that standard anatomic position. In this case, I measured that wound as being 30 inches below the top of the head and 7¼ inches to the left of his midline. Midline is an imaginary line drawn right down the middle of the body, dividing the left and right parts.
Yes, sir. Now, in the case of this bullet, you found no associated soot or stippling, correct?
That's correct. There is no soot or stippling around this wound.
All right. Now, there was not an exit wound in this case, is that correct?
That's correct. The bullet lodged in the body.
Okay. Can you tell us did you actually remove the bullet from the body?
Yes, I did.
And can you tell us where it was lodged?
It was lodged just under the skin, overlying the edge of the ribs on the right side.
Are you pointing to your ribs?
Yes.
If you could stand for the jury.
I'll stand for the jury. So the bottom of my ribs on the right side is right about here, and that is the approximate location of where I recovered the bullet that entered on the left side of his hip.
All right. And tell us about what it is you recovered, or how what did the projectile look like?
It had a flat nose. It had an orange or copper-colored jacket and a gray, probably lead-colored core that I could see through its base.
All right. And so it's gone in the left hip and it's found at the bottom right side of the rib cage. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. So could you describe for the jurors the path it took through the body and maybe what parts of the body it went through internally?
I'll look at my report as I talk. It went through part of a pelvic bone, so you might call it your hip bone. It went through a part of connective tissue that holds the colon. It went through loops of small intestine. It went through the diaphragm. It did not strike the lung, and then it lodged in the right side of the chest. So mostly striking intestines.
Okay. And again, what did you know about the direction of the bullet's travel?
In reference to that same position that I talked about, the direction was rightward, upward, and frontward.
All right. Thank you. Let's move next to what you have labeled a perforating gunshot wound of the torso, and I believe there's an entrance and an exit here. Is that correct? You've got it noted as AG.
That's correct.
Okay. Can you tell us about where you visually examined, I guess, entrance wound A?
Entrance A was on the left side of the upper back.
Left side of the upper back, okay. And could you orient us in terms of from the top of the head and the midline?
I specifically measured that wound as being 15½ inches below the top of the head and 2 7/8 inch left of midline.
All right. And tell us about the exit wound.
The exit wound was on the anterior left chest, and that was located 13 inches below the top of the head and 1 3/4 inches left of midline.
All right. Now, of course, you've got an entrance wound and exit wounds. There'd be no projectile associated with this gunshot wound, correct?
That's correct.
Nothing to pull out of the body.
Correct.
But can you tell us about the path the bullet took through the body from A to G?
Again, referring to my report, this bullet went through the left side of the back. It went through the left 7th intercostal space, which is the space between the left 7th and 8th ribs. It went through the left lung and then went through the left 2nd rib and the left 2nd rib's intercostal space, so kind of hitting both, and then exited.
All right. Now, you mentioned in your discussion of the path that when it perforates the left lung, it leaves hemorrhagic pulpified wound tract. Can you explain what that means?
So I use the term hemorrhagic pulpified wound tract to explain that there's not simply a neat hole that's punched through the lung. The bullet, and because of its velocity, is carrying a great amount of energy. That energy radiates through the tissues as the bullet passes through and causes a lot of damage. So in addition to a permanent hole that's left by the bullet's passage, there is bloody, injured tissue that surrounds that wound tract.
And you also mentioned that the left pleural cavity contained 1,000 milliliters of liquid blood. Can you kind of explain that portion of your report to the jury?
Each side of the chest has a pleural cavity, which is normally filled by the lung. However, when there is a lung injury, that lung injury will bleed. And in his case, the left side of his chest contained 1,000 milliliters of blood. So that's a liter of blood. Best way to understand that is picture your standard 2-liter soda bottle and imagine half that, and that's the amount of blood that was in the left side of the chest.
Yes, sir. And again, you noted, based on your entrance and exit wounds, the direction of the bullets travel.
In this case, the direction the bullets travel was frontward, upward, and rightward.
Now, what we're looking at here, I believe this is states 252, is the entrance wound A marked by that that small, I guess, ruler or decal that you've got on the back, or is it this up higher?
I'll stand so I can point for the jury. Right now, ignore the part with the white label down here. The entrance wound that we're talking about that I labeled as A is here on the left side of the upper back.
Yes, sir. Okay, and again, you've kind of explained entrance wounds, but this would be another good example maybe of showing the jury how the entrance wound looks in terms of the area around it. Is that correct?
That's correct. In this photograph, the wound is filled a little bit with blood, so it's a little bit harder to see. But again, we have a round defect, and it has that surrounding margin of abrasion as the bullet pushed its way into the skin.
All right, thank you. This way. I don't know if that necessarily in order.
Exit one.
May I approach? I'd like to look at a photograph with you up here.
Yes, sir.
This is G. Okay. Right. So this should stop. I believe this is states 253. Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
We mentioned already exit wound that I labeled as G, and I'm going to point to a little towards the top, mostly the center of the photograph, just above a white label. This is exit G.
Okay. Now, we haven't looked at an exit wound yet, so are you able to kind of point to this and describing to the jury how you determined that's an exit wound, or did you just do it by observing the path through the body?
Actually, this has characteristics of an exit wound. It's a little bit harder if you don't have the experience of doing a number of autopsies and looking at a number of gunshot wounds, but this is not really round. There is not the classic margin of abrasion, and it's difficult to appreciate in this photograph, but there are a few skin tags or pieces that we could roughly fold over and close this wound up, because in this case the bullet is coming out of the skin and it splits the skin open and comes out. It doesn't scrape the outside of the skin like it does when it's entering, and it doesn't punch out that round or oval defect.
Great. Thank you, sir. Now, I believe we need to move on to the next perforating gunshot wound of the torso. We've got that labeled as H and B. the entrance wound being H. Can you describe that for us and where it's found?
I labeled, in this case, the entrance wound as H, and it was on the left side of the chest, approximately 18 and 1/4 inches below the top of the head, and 6 1/2 inches left of midline.
All right. You mentioned also in your report that it has an irregular or elliptical defect. What does that mean?
I described it as slightly irregular but somewhat elliptical. It's not a perfect oval. It's a little bit off, and you can see that sometimes with entrance wounds, but it still does have the characteristics that allow me to identify it as an entrance wound.
Yes, sir. Okay. And again, it's 6 1/2 inches left of midline, so that would be almost to the side of the chest. Is that correct?
On the left side of the chest, yes.
Yes, sir. Okay. And so is this entrance H?
Again, I'll stand and I'll point to a wound that, as you face this photograph, is on your left, and I'll point here. This is the entrance wound that I labeled as entrance H. Again, it's nearly oval, but not a perfect oval, and it has that same classic margin of abrasion that I've previously described.
Yes, sir. Now, there's there appears to be another wound there. That is not exit B, is it?
So I believe that you're referring to this wound here, which is on the right side of the photograph as you face it. That is not the exit wound associated with that entrance wound.
Okay.
That's for a different wound that I have a feeling we'll discuss in a moment.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry, and going back briefly to entrance H, once again, no associated soot or stippling, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, exit B, where shall we find exit B?
Exit B is on the left side of the mid-back, approximately 20 1/2 inches below the top of the head and 3 1/4 inches left of midline.
And is this marked in the picture we already looked at with regards to this other entrance wound?
Yes, so in this case, the white label is just below exit wound B.
And again, you've characterized this as an exit wound. Can you talk about your observation of that and in further explaining an exit wound to the jurors?
So this wound is almost a slit as the bullet pops out and splits the skin. There's none of that scraping. There's none of that punching out, leaving a round or oval hole or defect like we previously described.
All right. Well, let's talk about the path of this bullet that's gone in at the left side of the chest and has come out, again, I guess the lower left side of the back. Can you tell us about the path you observed when you opened the body?
Again, I'll refer to my report as we do this. It went through the left 8th rib. It went through the diaphragm, which is the muscular sheet of tissue that separates the chest organs from the abdominal organs and allows you to breathe. It grazed the spleen. It again went through the diaphragm, which has a dome shape in the body. It went through the left 11th rib and then exited.
Yes, sir. Now, again, you mentioned a liter of liquid blood in the left pleural cavity and 50 milliliters in the right. Is that correct?
We have not yet mentioned, but the right side of the chest did have 50 milliliters of blood. Yes.
But we had previously mentioned the 1,000 milliliters of blood. Is this a separate collection of blood from the other wound, or is it just that these two gunshot paths have sort of crossed each other?
Excuse me. The left lung does have, or the left side of the chest has injuries from both wounds, and I can't say how much of that blood that ends up pooling in the left side of the chest came from one of these gunshots versus the other.
Yes, sir. Okay. I just wanted to be clear about that. And again, the direction of the bullet's travel was what?
In this wound, the direction was backward, downward, and rightward.
Okay. Thank you. Now, let's move on to the perforating gunshot wound of torso is how you have referred to it. CE, entrance C. Let's start with entrance C. Where did you find entrance C?
So, talking about another wound that went through and through the body, entrance C was centered approximately 18 inches below the top of the head and 8 inches left of midline on the left side of the chest.
Okay. Is this entrance wound C?
That's being pointed
Yeah, with
to
the cursor?
and has the white label underneath. Yes.
Yes, sir. And if you'd like to stand so you can explain your testimony to the jury with regards to this particular entrance wound. Now, we've been talking about stippling. Do you observe stippling here?
In this case, yes. I'll describe this wound in general. We know this is an entrance wound. It is an oval defect. It has the margin of abrasion around it. Excuse me. In addition, I mentioned earlier stippling, which are punctate abrasions from burning or unburned gunpowder particles striking the skin. And here we can see those, and these will show in the photo as little tiny red dots around this wound. Also around this wound, we see some black or dark gray material I'm pointing to with my finger in the center of this photograph, and that represents soot that also struck the body.
Okay, so stippling is essentially burns or bruises from the gunpowder, and then soot is the gunpowder itself on the body of the entrance wound?
Actually, the stippling is small scrapes.
Scrapes.
From the gunpowder striking the body, and then soot is deposition of burned material onto the body.
Yes, sir. And again, based on that, do you have an opinion as to at what distance a gun was fired from that entrance wound?
When we see stippling, we say that the range of fire is within a few inches to a few feet. The soot would suggest it was on the closer end of that spectrum, but I cannot tell you exactly how close it was. Someone would have to test fire the same weapon with the same type of ammunition in order to be able to make comparisons to determine determine what the range of fire was.
Yes, sir. Now, leaving entrance wound C, let's talk about exit wound E. Where was that located?
The wound I labeled as E was in the right axilla, or roughly the armpit, about 14 inches below the top of the head and 8 inches right of midline.
Now, does this depict exit E?
Yes.
Okay. Well, again, I see two injuries here, it appears. Which of these injuries have you determined to be exit E?
Exit E is the one that appears just above the white label.
Okay. And again, it's got more of a slit-like look, is that correct?
That's correct. It has characteristics of an exit wound.
Yes, sir. Okay. Well, tell the jury what you determined about the path of what we're calling CE.
This bullet, again referring to my report, went through the left side of the chest, through the left eighth intercostal space, or the space between the left eighth and ninth ribs. It went through the diaphragm. It excuse me, this is a long paragraph, and I'm trying to
Sure.
get everything in here. Grazed the spleen, it went through the stomach, it went through the liver, struck the other side of the diagram, struck the lower lobe of the right lung, and then went through the right sixth rib and exited.
All right. And again, you've it looks like you mentioned that it may have traveled, its path may have traveled through the same defect relating to another perforating gunshot wound to the torso. That's HB that you've already talked about. Is that correct?
Through the diaphragm, yes.
Yes, sir. So two of the shots may have actually passed through the same place in the diaphragm.
Yes.
Okay. And once again, we're in the left pleural cavity, and you've noted the 1,000 milliliters of liquid blood, correct?
Yes, and then this bullet also passed through the right side of the chest, and that's where we got that 50 milliliters that I mentioned earlier as well.
Yes, sir. And then the direction of this bullet?
The direction of this bullet was rightward, upward, and slightly frontward.
All right. Well, let's move finally to penetrating gunshot wound of right arm. This is entrance F.
We need to take a mid-afternoon recess.
Yes, sir.
Till 4:15. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll simply return to the jury deliberation room at 4 o'clock, 4:15, recall all my instructions, leave your notepads in your chairs. Everyone else, please remain seated for a moment.